Tonight we stand on a windswept glacier, the kind of place where the air itself seems to have teeth, and you realize with a clarity that cuts sharper than the wind that your life depends entirely on a single heavy wool blanket. The year is 1865, give or take a few, and you have just watched the last rays of sunlight abandon the peaks above you, taking with them any pretense of warmth. You feel the weight of that blanket strapped to your pack, not as a comfort but as a responsibility, because in this moment, as the first stars begin to punch through the violet sky, that coarse, scratchy, unyielding square of woven sheep is the only thing standing between you and a very permanent kind of cold. You probably won't survive this, if we're being honest with ourselves. The statistics are not in your favor. But that thought is a luxury you cannot afford right now, because you still have to make camp, and making camp at 10,000 feet in the 19th century is not a matter of unzipping a stuff sack and inflating a pad. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You stand there, on the ice, and you listen. The silence is not empty. It is a living thing, filled with the low groan of the glacier shifting beneath your feet, the occasional crack of a distant serac collapsing in on itself, and the whisper of wind that never, ever stops. You are wearing wool, head to toe. Wool trousers, a wool shirt, a wool waistcoat, a wool jacket, and a wool cap pulled down over your ears. You are, for all intents and purposes, a walking sheep, and yet you are cold. The cold here is not the damp chill of a London winter or the crisp bite of a country frost. It is a high, thin, predatory cold that seeks out every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin, every warm pocket of air you manage to trap against your body. It finds the gap between your glove and your sleeve, and it bites. It finds the tiny opening at your collar where your breath has melted a bit of frost, and it nips. And you have hours of this ahead of you. Hours until dawn. Hours in which the temperature will drop not gradually but in sudden, plunging steps as the last of the oath-stored heat radiates back into the void. You drop your pack onto the ice with a thud that sounds obscenely loud in the stillness. The pack contains your few possessions, a length of rope, an ice axe with a hickory shaft, a small cooking tin, some pemmican or hardtack if you are lucky, and the blanket. The blanket is not small. It is not lightweight. It is a proper, full-sized wool blanket, the kind your grandmother might have kept on the spare bed, the kind that smells faintly of lanolin and would smoke in ages past. It weighs somewhere between 5 and 8 pounds, which is a tremendous weight to carry up a mountain when every ounce feels like a stone, but you do not question it. You do not wish for something lighter, because you know, with the certainty of generations of experience, that this heavy, awkward, infuriatingly bulky object is the difference between waking up stiff and cold and not waking up at all. You look around for a place to spend the night. There is no cozy hut, no stone bivouac shelter, no overhanging rock. You are on a glacier, and a glacier is not a forgiving host. Its surface is a chaotic jumble of ice hummocks and crevasses, of wind-scoured sastrugi and patches of bare, blue ice hard as iron. You find a relatively flat spot, or what passes for flat in this world, a place where the snow has drifted into a shallow depression that might, if you are very fortunate, offer a fraction of shelter from the wind. You take off your pack and you begin the ritual. First, you stomp the snow down with your boots, packing it as firmly as you can. Then you take your ice axe and you use it to chop, to scrape, to level, creating a platform just long enough and just wide enough for you to lie down. It is slow, exhausting work at this altitude, and every few minutes you have to stop, lean on your axe, and gasp for breath in air that feels more like water than atmosphere. As you work, your mind drifts to the men who taught you this. The guides of Chamonix, the hunters of the Bernese Oberland, the generations of peasants who ventured onto these glaciers not for sport or glory but for crystals, for chamois, for the sheer necessity of survival. They knew the blanket not as a piece of equipment but as a companion. They knew that wool, with its ancient, patient magic, could absorb moisture without feeling wet, could trap heat even when soaked, could, if treated with respect, keep a man alive through a night that would freeze a block of granite solid. They passed this knowledge down not in books or lectures but in the simple act of doing, of showing, of handing a young man a blanket and saying, in a dialect you barely understand, "This is how you do not die." The platform is finally level enough. You unstrap the blanket and you lay it out on the snow, smoothing its folds, feeling its rough texture against your cold-numbed fingers. It is not soft. It is not comforting in any conventional sense. It is demanding. It requires something from you. It requires that you understand its limitations and its strengths, that you work with it rather than simply wrapping yourself in it and hoping for the best. You look at it, this square of woven wool, and you realize that it is not just a blanket. It is a shelter. It is a wall. It is a promise. And as the last light fades from the sky, leaving you alone with the stars and the cold and the endless, groaning silence of the ice, you know that tonight, that promise is all you have. You lie there, shivering despite your layers, and you begin to understand why wool, of all the materials on earth, became the undisputed king of alpine survival. It is not because sheep are particularly noble creatures, though they do possess a certain stoic dignity as they stand in fields chewing cud and looking vaguely disappointed in human progress. No, the reason lies in the hair itself, in the microscopic architecture of each individual fiber, a structure so ingenious that even our most advanced synthetic laboratories spent decades trying and largely failing to replicate it. You run your fingers over the blanket's surface, feeling the slight prickle against your skin, and you are touching something that evolution spent millions of years perfecting on the backs of wild mouflon long before humans ever thought to domesticate them. The wool fiber is not smooth like human hair or cotton. Under a microscope, it resembles a stack of cones or a pine cone covered in overlapping scales. These scales are the first secret. They create tiny air pockets between fibers when they are spun together, trapping your body heat in a million microscopic dead air spaces that the wind cannot easily penetrate. But they do something else, something almost magical. They create friction. They grip each other. This is why wool does not simply slide apart like silk or collapse flat like cotton when you move. It maintains its loft, its spring, its stubborn insistence on holding on to warm air even as you toss and turn on a bed of ice. But warmth is only half the story, and perhaps not even the most important half. The real miracle of wool, the thing that made it non-negotiable for men sleeping on glacier, is its relationship with water. You are sweating. You do not want to sweat. You know that sweating is dangerous, that moisture against the skin in freezing temperatures is a death warrant wrapped in fabric, but your body does not consult you on these matters. You climbed for hours to reach this spot, hauling yourself and your gear up steep ice and loose rock, and your body responded the only way it knows how. It produced moisture. Lots of it. Your wool underlayers are damp, your shirt is damp, even your waistcoat feels slightly clammy against your chest. If you were wearing cotton, you would already be in serious trouble. Cotton, for all its comfort in gentle climates, becomes a cold, wet rag against the skin when damp, wicking heat away from your body at an alarming rate. It is, in the language of mountaineers, a killer. But wool does something different. Wool fibers are hygroscopic, meaning they absorb water vapor into their structure without feeling wet to the touch. Each fiber can hold up to 30% of its weight in moisture while still feeling dry against your skin. The water molecules bond chemically with the protein structure of the keratin, slipping inside the fiber rather than clinging to its surface. This generates a tiny amount of heat, by the way, a phenomenon called the heat absorption. As your sweat vapor is absorbed into the wool, it releases heat right there against your skin. It is not much, just a whisper of warmth, but on a night like this, you will take any whisper you can get. You think about the alternatives as you lie there, staring up at stars that seem close enough to touch. Fur, for instance. Fur is beautiful, warm, and undeniably effective. You have seen the Russian fur traders in their sable hats, the Arctic explorers in their wolfskin parkas. But fur has problems. It is heavy when wet, slow to dry, and it comes with the considerable complication of requiring an animal to die for each garment. More critically for the practical mountaineer, fur is directional. It is designed by nature to be worn with the fur side out, the hide side in, so that snow can be brushed off the smooth outer surface while the inner fibers trap heat against the skin. Wear it backwards and you have a snow-catching, heat-losing disaster. Wool, on the other hand, is non-directional. It works the same from either side. It can be woven, felted, knitted, or fulled. It can be made into blankets that are the same on both sides, that shed snow regardless of orientation, that can be wrapped, folded, tucked, and arranged in any configuration the desperate human mind can devise. You shift on your ice platform, pulling the blanket tighter around your shoulders, and you consider feathers. Eiderdown, specifically, plucked from the nests of Arctic ducks, was already known in your time as the lightest, loftiest insulation available. The wealthy of Europe stuffed their comforters with it and slept in cloud-like warmth while the rest of the world shivered under wool. But down, for all its wonder, has a catastrophic weakness. One that you are intimately familiar with even if you have never held a down garment in your hands. Down clumps. When wet, it loses all its loft, all its insulating air, collapsing into a sodden mass of feathers that provides about as much warmth as a wet paper bag. And you are sleeping on a glacier. Everything is wet. Not soaking wet, perhaps, but damp. The snow beneath you melts slightly from your body heat, creating a thin film of moisture that seeps into everything. Your breath condenses on the inside of the blanket. The air itself carries a heavy load of humidity, even at these temperatures. Down would be a disaster within hours. Wool just keeps working. There is a debate among historians, one that will never be fully settled, about whether the early alpine pioneers consciously understood the physics of wool or simply learned through trial and error that wool worked and other things did not. Some argue that the shepherds and hunters who first ventured onto the glacier carried wool simply because it was what they had, what their fathers had, what the sheep on the hillsides provided. Others suggest that the properties of wool were well understood in folk knowledge, passed down in the practical language of grandmothers and weavers who knew without microscopes that wool kept you warm even when wet, that wool did not freeze stiff like linen, that wool could be the difference between a story told and a body found in the spring thaw. You lie there, wrapped in your own wool blanket, and you think you understand both perspectives. You do not need to know the chemistry of keratin to feel its effects. You do not need a laboratory to tell you that your blanket is dry against your skin while the snow beneath you slowly melts. You just need to survive until dawn. And right now, in this moment, that feels like enough. The wind has picked up now, a low moan that skims across the glacier surface and sends tiny grains of ice skittering against your blanket like microscopic thrown salt. And you realize that simply having wool is not enough. You must know the ritual. You must understand that there is a right way and a wrong way to wrap yourself for an alpine night, and the wrong way leads to a very still, very cold body discovered by some future party of climbers who will remark on how peaceful you look, which is their polite way of saying they will never use that particular bivouac spot again. The guides taught you this, back in the valley, in the smoky warmth of a Chamonix in where the idea of cold seemed abstract and almost pleasant. They taught you with gestures and grunts and the occasional translated phrase, demonstrating on tabletops with napkins what they meant you to do with your blanket on the ice. You watched, you nodded, you bought them another round of wine, and you thought you understood. Now, with the wind eating at your exposed cheeks and the temperature dropping past anything you have ever experienced, you realize you understood nothing. First, You must find the right place. Not just flat, not just sheltered, but positioned with an almost supernatural awareness of the wind's behavior. You studied the surface before you lay down, looking for the telltale patterns of wind-scoured ice and drifted snow, the way the sastrugi pointed like frozen weather vanes toward the prevailing wind. You chose a spot in the lee of a small pressure ridge, a fold in the glacier's skin that rises maybe 3 feet above the surrounding ice. It is not much, but it is something. It will break the wind's force just enough to matter, just enough to keep your blanket from being constantly buffeted and its warm air stolen by the moving air. You learned this from watching chamois, those ghost gray goats that haunt the high peaks, how they always bed down on the lee side of rocks and ridges, how they tuck their noses under their flanks and let the mountain's own geometry protect them. You are not so different from a chamois tonight, though considerably less graceful and equipped with significantly worse fur. Now you sit on the blanket, or rather, you sit on a portion of it, because the blanket must be both beneath you and above you, and this requires a folding technique that feels like origami designed by someone who actively dislikes you. You fold the blanket lengthwise, not in half but in a proportion that leaves roughly 2/3 on one side and 1/3 on the other. The larger portion will go beneath you, because the cold coming up through the ice is just as deadly as the wind, and in some ways more insidious. It seeps. It conducts. It reaches up through whatever thin barrier you provide and pulls the heat from your body directly into the glacier's vast, indifferent mass. You need insulation beneath you, and you need a lot of it. The smaller portion becomes your cover, drawn up over your body and tucked around your shoulders and neck. But this is only the beginning. You take off your boots. This feels like madness, like the first step towards certain death, because your feet are cold and the idea of exposing them to this air seems suicidal. But the guides were insistent. Boots, they explained through pantomime and broken French, trap moisture. Your feet sweat inside the leather, and that sweat has nowhere to go. It soaks your socks, it cools, and by morning your feet will be white and numb and possibly lost to frostbite. Worse, wet boots freeze solid overnight, becoming rigid casts that you cannot put back on without hours of work thawing them by the fire you do not have. So you remove them, and you place them in the bottom of your pack, upside down, so that any moisture can drain and any residual heat can escape without freezing them into shape. You put on dry socks, the last pair you have, wool of course, and you pull them up over your wool trousers to create a seal against drafts. Then you curl onto your blanket, fetal position, because this is the shape that loses the least heat, the shape that presents the smallest surface area to the cold. The blanket comes up and over you, and you begin the process of tucking. This is not gentle. This is not cozy in any domestic sense. You are creating a seal, a barrier, a cocoon that must be airtight at every edge because any gap, any tiny opening, will become a chimney through which your hard-warmed air escapes and the killing cold pours in. You tuck the edges under your body, under your legs, under your feet. You pull the top edge up over your head, leaving only a small breathing hole, and you weigh that edge down with your ice axe so it does not blow open in the night. You are now, to any observer who might wander past in the darkness, a shapeless lump on the ice, indistinguishable from a rock or a snowdrift or a body. You are sealed. You are contained. You are as warm as you are going to get. And still, you shiver. Shivering is your body's last defense, its final argument against the cold, a series of involuntary muscle contractions that generate heat through pure mechanical effort. It is exhausting. It burns calories you cannot spare, energy you need for survival. But it is also a sign that you are still alive, still fighting, still in the game. The guides told you to worry when the shivering stops. They told you that the warm, sleepy feeling that replaces it is not warmth at all but the beginning of the end, the point at which your body gives up and begins its slow, mistaken slide toward a peace that is not peace but death. So you shiver, and you welcome it, and you curl tighter, and you listen to the wind. Historians still debate the origins of these bivouac techniques, whether they were developed independently in mountain ranges across the world or spread through the movements of shepherds and traders and wandering hunters. What is certain is that by the mid-19th century, the great alpine guides had elevated blanket sleeping to something approaching an art form. They could look at a slope, at the sky, at the way the snow lay on the ground, and predict with uncanny accuracy what kind of night it would be and how much blanket they would need. They carried wool not just for warmth but for versatility, for its ability to be folded into 1,000 configurations, for its patient willingness to be whatever its owner needed it to be. And as you lie there, sealed in your woolen cocoon, you understand that you are not just sleeping on a glacier. You are participating in a tradition as old as human interaction with high places, a tradition written not in books but in the careful, deliberate movements of men who learned, through generations of trial and often fatal error, exactly how to spend a night on the ice and see the morning. The night deepens around you, and as you lie there in your woolen cocoon, you begin to understand that the cold is not your only enemy. There is something else lurking in the darkness, something that the men of the 19th century feared with a dread that bordered on superstition. They called it mountain sickness, but that name covered a multitude of terrors, from the simple headache and nausea of altitude to something far more sinister that they believed could steal into a sleeping man and extinguish his life without a struggle. You think about this as you drift in and out of a restless half-sleep, because the medical theories of your time are strange and sometimes terrifying, and they shape everything about how you approach this night on the ice. The idea that you might simply stop breathing, that your blood might thicken and pool in your extremities, that the very act of falling asleep could be a betrayal of your own will to live. These thoughts press against you like the cold itself. The doctors of the era, the ones who write learned papers for the Royal Society and correspond with colleagues across Europe, have developed elaborate theories about what happens to the human body at altitude. Some believe that the air itself becomes toxic, poisoned by unknown vapors rising from deep within the earth. Others argue that the reduced pressure allows the blood to expand, to press against the delicate vessels of the brain until consciousness flickers and fails. A few, the more scientifically minded, have begun to understand something about oxygen, about its role in sustaining life, but their ideas are new and controversial and not widely accepted among the gentlemen who fund alpine expeditions. You carry their uncertainty with you like an extra weight, because every ache, every dizziness, every moment of confusion becomes a potential symptom of something fatal. When your head pounds as you climb, is it simply exertion or the beginning of cerebral edema? When you feel nauseous on the glacier, is it your last meal or the first sign that your body is failing in this thin, cruel air? The blanket, you realize, is not just warmth. It is a kind of medical intervention, a way of managing symptoms that the doctors barely understand. The guides know this without being able to explain it. They know that a warm man is a living man, that cold stresses the body in ways that make every other threat worse. They know that shivering burns energy, and that energy burned is energy that cannot be used to keep the brain functioning, the heart pumping, the blood moving through vessels that constrict in the cold. So the blanket becomes a form of treatment, a way of reducing the demands on your overtaxed system, of giving your body one less thing to fight. When you are warm, you can rest. When you rest, you conserve strength. When you conserve strength, you have a chance of waking in the morning with enough energy to continue, or to retreat, or to simply survive until help arrives. But sleep itself is the problem, or at least the fear of sleep. You have heard the stories, the ones the guides tell in hushed voices after too much wine, about men who lay down to rest and never rose again. Not from avalanche or crevasse or falling rock, but from something quieter, something that stole in while they slept and simply took them. The guides call it the sleep of the mountain, and they speak of it with a reverence usually reserved for saints and demons. Some say it is a mercy, a gentle end for those who have fought too long. Others say it is a trap, a deception of the cold that makes death feel like warmth, like comfort, like finally giving in to a tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You think about this as you lie there, and you force yourself to stay awake, to remain conscious, to keep fighting the urge to simply let go and drift into whatever comes next. The medical debates of the era reflect this fear. Prominent physicians argue passionately about whether sleep at altitude is inherently dangerous, whether the body's vital functions slow to the point of failure, whether the blood thickens like cooling wax and stops flowing through the lungs. One school of thought holds that sleep is essential, that the body must rest to recover from the exertions of climbing. Another insists that sleep must be avoided at all costs, that climbers should push through the night, keep moving, keep the blood circulating through sheer force of will. The guides, practical men who have seen more deaths than most doctors have treated patients, split the difference. They sleep, but they sleep carefully. They wake each other through the night, checking for signs of trouble, making sure that the warmth of the blanket has not become a trap. They know that a man who stops shivering is a man in danger, whether he feels warm or not. You have your own system, improvised from their teachings. You set yourself small tasks, mental games that keep your mind engaged while your body rests. You count the stars visible through your breathing hole, though the hole is small and the stars seem to shift and dance in the thin air. You recite poetry, the long narrative kind that takes minutes to get through, the kind that forces you to remember the next line, the next verse, the next stanza. You think about the morning, about the first pale light that will creep across the glacier and tell you that you have survived another night. You think about the valley below, about warmth and food and the sound of human voices. And through it all, you hold onto the blanket, that rough woolen companion, and you thank whatever forces of evolution and human ingenuity brought it here to this ice with you. Historians still argue about the exact role of medical theory in the development of alpine equipment and technique. Some say that the doctors lagged behind the practitioners, that the guides knew what worked long before science could explain why. Others point to the careful observations of physician climbers, men who recorded their symptoms and their remedies with the precision of laboratory notes, creating a body of knowledge that slowly, over decades, transformed mountain sickness from a mysterious curse into a set of manageable conditions. What is certain is that every climber who spent a night on the ice in the 19th century carried not just a blanket but a collection of fears and theories and half-understood warnings, and that these intangibles shape the experience as surely as the temperature and the wind. You carry them now, these ghosts of medical history, and they keep you awake, keep you vigilant, keep you alive in a way that no blanket alone could manage. As the night stretches on and you continue your vigil against the cold, you become acutely aware that your heavy wool blanket is not merely a piece of survival equipment. It is a statement. It is a declaration of who you are and where you come from, written in the language of fiber and weave and the unmistakable heft of quality British manufacture. You are, if the contents of your pack are any indication, almost certainly a gentleman, or at least a man who moves in the company of gentlemen, and your blanket has been chosen with the same care you would apply to selecting a tailor or commissioning a pair of boots. It is not the rough, undyed wool of the local peasants, the kind of blanket that shepherds have used for centuries in these very mountains. No, yours is something finer, something that speaks of mills in Yorkshire and merchants in London and a whole complex web of industry and commerce that has transformed the simple act of keeping warm into a matter of national pride. You run your fingers over the blanket's surface, and you can feel the difference. The wool is still coarse by the standards of your drawing room, still scratchy against skin accustomed to linen and silk, but it has been fulled, a process of controlled matting that compresses the fibers and creates a denser, more wind-resistant fabric. It has been dyed, probably in deep navy or forest green or the rich burgundy that has become fashionable among climbing gentlemen. It might even bear the label of a specific manufacturer, A name that carries weight in the clubs and learned societies where men gather to discuss their exploits and plan their next assaults on the unconquered peaks. This is not accidental. This is deliberate. Because in the 19th century, what you carry into the mountains is as much a marker of social standing as what you wear to the opera. The British, you have to understand, have a complicated relationship with the Alps. They did not discover them, obviously. The local populations had been living in and around these mountains for millennia, hunting, farming, trading, and occasionally dying in them with a frequency that rendered the whole enterprise unremarkable. But the British invented something new. They invented the idea of the Alps as a playground, as a testing ground, as a place where gentlemen could prove their mettle and return home with stories that would be read aloud at society dinners and published in expensive editions for those who could not make the journey themselves. And with this invention came a whole new set of rules about what was proper, what was acceptable, what marked a man as a serious explorer rather than a mere tourist with a tendency to wander uphill. Your blanket participates in this performance. It is heavy, impossibly heavy by modern standards, but its weight is part of its meaning. A light blanket would suggest that you were trying to cheat, to avoid the burdens that real climbers accept as part of the enterprise. A local blanket, the kind you could buy in any village in the valley, would mark you as someone who did not understand that the point of climbing was not merely to reach the summit but to do so with style, with elegance, with the unmistakable stamp of British civilization imposed upon the savage grandeur of the mountains. So you carry your heavy, impractical, gloriously excessive wool blanket, and you carry it with pride, because it tells everyone who sees it that you are the real thing, that you belong to that select brotherhood of men who measure themselves against the highest peaks on earth. The irony, of course, is that the blanket itself is not British at all, not really. The wool probably came from sheep grazing on hillsides that look remarkably like these very Alps, because the British wool industry has long relied on imports to supplement its domestic production. The weaving might have happened in Yorkshire, but the raw material traveled across borders and through markets, passing through the hands of merchants who cared nothing for national pride and everything for the price per bale. And the design, the basic concept of a heavy wool blanket for mountain use, owes everything to the local populations who have been doing exactly this for centuries, using exactly these materials, with none of the social signaling that you and your companions have layered on top of the simple act of survival. Your blanket is a collaboration, whether you acknowledge it or not, between the sheep of the continent, the weavers of England, and the accumulated wisdom of every shepherd who ever spent a night on a high pass with nothing but wool between himself and the stars. You think about this as you lie there, and you wonder what the guides think of your blanket, of all your carefully chosen equipment. They are polite, of course. They are professionals. They will carry your absurdly heavy loads, cook your meals, wake you at the proper hours, and lead you up and down the mountain with a patience that seems almost supernatural. But they must have opinions. They must look at your blanket, at your boots, at your ice axe with its polished shaft and engraved head, and see a whole world of assumptions about what matters and what does not. They know that a blanket is for warmth, not for display. They know that a man who needs to prove something on the mountain is a man who might die on the mountain, taking his guides with him. And yet they go along with it, because this is how they make their living, how they feed their families, how they maintain a foothold in a world that is rapidly changing around them. Historians still debate the exact role of national identity in the development of alpinism. Some argue that the British essentially invented the sport, creating the institutions, the language, the very concept of mountain climbing as a leisure activity. Others point to the Swiss, the French, the Italians, the Germans, all of whom had their own traditions of mountain travel that long predated the arrival of the first British gentlemen with their ropes and their guides and their heavy wool blankets. What is certain is that by the middle of the 19th century, the Alps had become a stage on which national rivalries were played out in miniature, with each country's climbers claiming superior skill, superior courage, superior equipment. Your blanket, heavy and British and utterly impractical, is part of that performance. It is a flag planted on the ice, a declaration that even here, even now, you carry your civilization with you. The wind shifts suddenly, a violent gust that slams into your makeshift shelter and tries to peel your blanket away from your body. And you realize with a cold surge of adrenaline that your carefully chosen spot in the lee of the pressure ridge is no longer sufficient. The mountain has changed its mind about which direction the wind should blow, or perhaps it never cared about your comfort in the first place, and now you face a choice that will define the rest of your night and possibly the rest of your life. You can stay where you are, trust that your tucking and folding will hold against this new assault, and hope that the wind tires of its game before you tire of existence. Or you can move, which means exposing yourself to the full force of the storm, losing what little warmth you have preserved, and attempting to find or create a new shelter in conditions that are rapidly becoming impossible. You choose a third option, the one the guides taught you when they spoke of the blanket not as a covering but as a structure, not as something to wrap yourself in but as something to build with. You sit up, and the cold hits you like a physical blow. The wind, now unimpeded by your body's warmth, tears through your clothing and steals heat from every exposed surface. You have perhaps minutes before the situation becomes critical, before the combination of wind and cold overwhelms your body's ability to compensate. You work quickly, not frantically, because frantic is how mistakes happen, how edges are lost and folds are forgotten and blankets become useless sheets flapping in the wind. You grab your ice axe, the one you used to weigh down the top edge of your cocoon, and you drive its shaft into the snow beside you. Not straight down, because that would offer nothing to hold, but at an angle, creating a post that leans slightly away from the wind. Then you take your blanket and you drape it over this makeshift pole, creating a tent where before there was only a cocoon. This is the moment when the blanket reveals its full versatility, its willingness to be more than just a covering. You have seen the guides do this, watch them transform a square of wool into a shelter that can withstand winds that would flatten a canvas tent. They use what they have, which is never much, and they make it enough. The blanket becomes a roof, a wall, a windbreak, depending on how you arrange it and what you have to hold it in place. You have your ice axe, you have your pack, you have the rocks that you should have collected earlier but didn't because you were tired and cold and not thinking clearly. You scramble now, crawling on hands and knees across the ice, gathering whatever stones you can find, whatever chunks of frozen snow, whatever debris the wind has scoured from the glacier's surface. You bring them back to your emerging shelter and you use them to weigh down the edges of the blanket, creating a seal against the wind that is far from perfect but infinitely better than nothing. The structure you are building is not a tent in any conventional sense. It is more like a lean-to, a simple sloping roof that breaks the wind and provides a space underneath where you can crouch and wait out the storm. The blanket, because it is wool, does not flap and crackle like canvas would. It absorbs the wind's energy, muffles it, softens it into something almost bearable. The edges, weighed down by rocks and snow, hold against gusts that would lift a lighter fabric and send it sailing into the darkness. You crawl underneath, into the narrow space between the blanket and the ice, and you pull your pack in after you. You are still cold, still shivering, still aware that this shelter is temporary and fragile and might collapse at any moment. But you are also, for the first time since the wind shifted, no longer actively dying. The storm rages above you, a symphony of wind and ice that would be beautiful if it were not trying to kill you. You listen to it from your woolen cave, and you think about the men who taught you this trick, the guides who have spent more nights in improvised shelters than you have spent in comfortable beds. They learned this not from books or lectures but from necessity, from the simple fact that mountains do not care about your plans and weather does not consult your schedule. When the storm hits, and it always hits eventually, you either adapt or you die. The blanket, because it is wool and because it is heavy and because it can be shaped into 100 different forms, becomes your adaptation. It is not the best shelter you could imagine. It is not warm and dry and comfortable. But it is enough, and on a night like this, enough is everything. You think about the alternatives, the ones you do not have. A proper mountain tent, the kind that explorers are beginning to use in the Arctic and the high Himalayas, would be wonderful right now. But such tents are rare, expensive, and largely untested in the Alps. They are made of canvas, usually, treated with linseed oil or rubber to make them waterproof, and they weigh far more than even your heavy wool blanket. The guides look at them with suspicion, these modern inventions that promise so much and deliver so unpredictably. They prefer what they know, what their fathers knew, what has kept generations of shepherds alive through storms far worse than this one. They prefer wool. And as you crouch in your woolen lean-to, listening to the wind scream across the ice, you understand why. Historians still argue about the exact moment when the wool blanket ceased to be merely a covering and became a piece of mountain equipment. Some point to the early chamois hunters, who carried blankets not for sleeping but for building shelters in the high pastures where no natural protection existed. Others credit the crystal seekers, who spent days and sometimes weeks on the glacier, pursuing the precious minerals that formed in the mountain's veins and brought high prices in the valley markets. What is certain is that by the time the first recreational climbers arrived in the Alps, the blanket had already been transformed by generations of practical use into something far more versatile than its original designers ever intended. It was a bed, a tent, a windbreak, a signal flag, a stretcher for the injured, a shroud for the dead. It was whatever its owner needed it to be, and it asked nothing in return except to be carried, heavy and awkward and indispensable, up into the thin air where survival depended on such humble magic. The storm passes eventually, as storms always do, leaving behind a stillness that feels almost sacred in its intensity, and you crawl out from under your blanket tent to find a world transformed. The glacier has been scoured clean by the wind, its surface polished to a hard, blue sheen that reflects the first hints of dawn in ways that hurt your eyes. You stand there, stamping your feet to restore circulation, and you think about the relationship between your heavy wool blanket and the other materials that are beginning to appear in the alpine world. You are living through a moment of transition, a time when the old ways are being challenged by new technologies, and your blanket, ancient and unchanging as it seems, is part of a much larger story about how humans learned to survive in places where survival was never guaranteed. The most exciting new material, the one that has everyone talking in the climbing clubs and learned societies, is rubberized fabric. A man named Charles McIntosh, working in Glasgow, figured out how to sandwich a layer of liquid rubber between two layers of fabric, creating a material that was truly waterproof, not just water-resistant. The implications for mountain travel were immediately obvious to anyone who had ever spent a wet night shivering under a damp blanket. With a Macintosh blanket, or better yet a Macintosh tent, you could sleep through a rainstorm without waking up soaked. You could cross wet snow without feeling the moisture seep through to your skin. You could, in theory, stay dry in conditions that would reduce wool to a sodden, heavy mess. But theory and practice, as you have learned many times on this mountain, are not always the same thing. The early rubberized fabrics had problems, serious problems that the inventors were slow to acknowledge and slower to fix. They were heavy, first of all, because the rubber layer added significant weight to an already substantial fabric. They were stiff, especially in cold weather, cracking and creasing in ways that compromised their waterproof qualities. They smelled, a persistent chemical odor that clung to everything and could not be washed out. And they deteriorated, the rubber breaking down over time and exposure, leaving you with a fabric that was no longer waterproof and no longer breathable but still heavy and stiff and smelly. Your wool blanket, for all its limitations, did none of these things. It was predictable. It was reliable. It would be the same tomorrow as it was today, and the same next year as it was tomorrow. You think about canvas as you begin to pack up your shelter, folding the blanket with movements that have become almost automatic. Canvas is another contender in the race for the perfect mountain material, a dense cotton fabric that can be treated to resist water and wind. It is stronger than wool, more resistant to tearing and abrasion. It can be woven into precise shapes, tents and tarpaulins and ground cloths that offer protection wool cannot match. The American explorers, the ones pushing west across their vast continent, swear by canvas. They use it for wagon covers, for tents, for the very clothing on their backs. But canvas has its own problems. It is heavy when dry and heavier when wet, absorbing water like a sponge and taking forever to dry. It rots if stored damp, developing mildew that weakens the fibers and leaves you with a tent that falls apart the first time the wind blows. And it is cold, conducting heat away from your body far more efficiently than wool, so that a canvas shelter keeps out the rain but offers nothing in the way of warmth. The debate among climbers, the one that plays out in every mountain inn and every learned society meeting, is about trade-offs. Do you want waterproof or breathable? Do you want light or warm? Do you want the latest technology, with all its untested promise, or the old reliability, with all its well-known limitations? Your wool blanket represents one side of this debate, the side that says warmth is the primary concern, that a cold man is a dead man, that all the waterproofing in the world means nothing if your body temperature drops below the point of no return. The rubberized canvas advocates argue the opposite, that wet kills faster than cold, that a dry man can survive temperatures that would kill a wet one, that the future belongs to materials that keep water out regardless of what they weigh or how they feel against the skin. You find yourself somewhere in the middle, as most climbers do. You carry your wool blanket, yes, but you also carry a small piece of oiled silk, a recent innovation that weighs almost nothing and can be used as an emergency shelter or ground cloth. You have a rubberized cape, a Macintosh garment that you wear over your wool layers when the rain is heavy enough to justify its weight and bulk. You are hybrid, a creature of compromise, taking the best of both worlds and hoping that the combination proves greater than either alone. The guides look at your collection of materials with a mixture of amusement and respect. They have seen fads come and go, technologies that promised everything and delivered nothing. They have also seen genuine improvements, innovations that made their work safer and their lives easier. They reserve judgment, waiting to see what lasts and what fades, what proves itself on the mountain and what fails when it matters most. Historians still debate the precise timeline of this technological transition, the moment when wool began to lose its monopoly on mountain survival. Some point to the 1850s, when rubberized fabrics first became widely available and climbers began experimenting with them in earnest. Others argue for the 1860s, when the first purpose-built mountain tents appeared, designed specifically for the challenges of high-altitude camping. What is certain is that your generation of climbers is the first to have choices, the first to stand on a glacier and decide not just how to use your equipment but what equipment to bring in the first place. It is a freedom that previous generations never had, and it comes with a burden. Because now, when things go wrong, when the cold seeps in or the wet soaks through, you have only yourself to blame. You made the choices. You selected the materials. You decided what to carry and what to leave behind. And on a night like this, with the dawn just beginning to color the eastern sky, those choices feel very real and very permanent. The first light of dawn creeps across the glacier, painting the seracs in shades of pink and gold that would make a painter weep, and you begin the slow, painful process of extracting yourself from your woolen cocoon and preparing for another day of climbing. Your body protests every movement, every stretch, every attempt to restore function to limbs that have spent the night folded into positions no human joint was designed to maintain. But you have no choice. The mountain waits for no one, and your guides are already moving, stamping their feet and swinging their arms and generally demonstrating a level of vitality that seems almost insulting given the night you have all just survived. You watch them as you pack your blanket, and you think about what it costs to carry this essential piece of equipment up into the thin air where every ounce feels like a stone. The blanket weighs somewhere between 5 and 8 pounds, depending on its size and the density of its weave. This does not sound like much when you read about it in a comfortable chair, surrounded by the familiar comforts of civilization. 5 pounds is a bag of sugar, a small cat, a stack of books. It is nothing. You could carry 5 pounds all day without noticing it, or so you tell yourself before you ever set foot on a glacier. But 5 pounds on a mountain is not 5 pounds anywhere else. It is 5 pounds multiplied by every step, every breath, every moment of exhaustion when your legs tremble and your lungs burn and your mind screams at you to stop, to rest, to drop this ridiculous weight and simply lie down on the ice and let whatever happens happen. It is 5 pounds that must be strapped to your pack in exactly the right way, balanced against the other weights you carry, adjusted and readjusted as the day wears on and your body's geometry changes with fatigue. It is 5 pounds that you will curse, that you will silently hate, that you will promise to replace with something lighter if you ever make it off this mountain alive. But you do not replace it, because you cannot. There is nothing lighter that does the same job, nothing that offers the same combination of warmth, versatility, and reliability. You carry the weight because you must, because the alternative is to freeze. And freezing is a more permanent condition than exhaustion. The guides understand this in a way that you, with your comfortable life and your amateur enthusiasm, can only begin to grasp. They have been carrying heavy loads since childhood, since long before they ever thought of climbing as anything other than a way to make a living. They have carried wood and water, hay and stone, the countless heavy objects that a subsistence life in the mountains requires. They have carried injured climbers down from high places, dead ones too, when the mountain claimed another victim. They know what weight means, what it costs, what it asks of a human body. And they know that some weights are necessary, that some loads must be borne regardless of the cost, because the alternative is unthinkable. You watch them now as they prepare for the day's climb, dividing the communal equipment among themselves with the efficiency of long practice. Each guide will carry his own blanket, of course, because a guide who freezes is no guide at all. But they will also carry the rope, the extra food, the cooking equipment, the various odds and ends that a party of climbers needs to survive above the snow line. Their packs are enormous, bulging with gear that would break your back if you tried to lift it, let alone carry it up a mountain. And yet they move with a grace that seems almost supernatural, shifting their loads, balancing their weight, finding the path of least resistance through terrain that offers no easy options. They have learned, through years of practice, that weight is not just something to be endured but something to be managed, distributed, worked with rather than against. You think about the porters you passed on the way up, the men who carry even heavier loads to even higher places, supporting the scientific expeditions and surveying parties that are pushing into the farthest reaches of the mountain world. These men, drawn from the local populations, carry loads that would be unthinkable in any other context: 100-pound packs, awkward bundles of scientific instruments, coils of rope that weigh more than a small child. They do it for wages that seem impossibly low to your eyes, wages that would not buy a decent meal in London or Paris. But they do it with a dignity that commands respect, a quiet acceptance of the burden that comes with living in the shadow of mountains that offer both livelihood and death in equal measure. Their blankets are part of this burden, carried for themselves and sometimes for their employers, folded and strapped and balanced alongside everything else the mountain demands. The weight of the blanket, you realize, is not just physical. It is psychological, emotional, even spiritual. It is the weight of responsibility, of knowing that this object, this simple square of woven wool, is the difference between life and death. It is the weight of tradition, of carrying forward practices that have kept people alive in these mountains for centuries. It is the weight of connection, of being linked to every shepherd, every hunter, every climber who has ever spent a night on the ice and lived to tell about it. When you strap that blanket to your pack, you are not just carrying wool. You are carrying history. You are carrying knowledge. You are carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned, through trial and often fatal error, exactly what it takes to survive in places where survival was never guaranteed. Historians still argue about the economics of these expeditions, about who carried what and why and at what cost. Some focus on the gentleman climbers, the wealthy amateurs who funded and led the great alpine assaults. Others study the guides and porters, the working men who made these climbs possible and whose contributions have often been overlooked in the official accounts. What is certain is that every expedition, every successful summit, every tragic failure, rested on the backs of men who carried weight so that others could climb. And at the center of it all, heavy and humble and utterly essential, was the wool blanket, carried by everyone, needed by everyone, shared when necessary, mourned when lost. You carry yours now, up into the morning light, and you carry it with a new understanding of what it means to bear such a burden. The sun is fully up now, and you are moving again, climbing across the glacier toward the ridge that will lead you higher, and you become aware of a new enemy. It is not the wind, which has died to a manageable whisper. It is not the cold, which retreats before the sun's strengthening rays. It is water. Not the dramatic water of rivers and waterfalls, but the insidious, creeping water that appears wherever the sun touches the ice, turning the hard, reliable surface into a treacherous slush that soaks everything it touches. Your boots are wet. Your trousers are wet. And your blanket, that faithful companion of the long night, is beginning to absorb moisture from the air itself, from the saturated atmosphere that rises off the melting glacier like breath from a giant's mouth. You have entered the daily battle against damp, a struggle that will occupy every moment of daylight and shape every decision you make about when to stop, where to camp, how to preserve the precious dryness of the one piece of equipment that can keep you alive through another night. The blanket, for all its miraculous properties, has limits. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling wet, but beyond that point, it begins to fail. The air pockets that trap your body heat fill with water instead, turning insulation into conductor, warmth into cold. The fibers swell, closing the spaces between them and reducing the blanket's ability to breathe. The weight increases, adding to the burden you carry and the effort required to move. And if the moisture freezes, as it will when the sun sets and the temperature plummets, you will find yourself with a blanket that is less a covering and more a sheet of ice, rigid and useless and possibly fatal. You watch the guides as they climb, and you see how they manage this enemy. They stop frequently at dry spots, patches of rock or bare ice where they can rest without soaking their clothing. They adjust their layers, opening vents and removing outer garments to let sweat evaporate rather than accumulate. They check each other's packs, making sure that blankets are protected, that nothing is rubbing against wet snow, that the precious dry wool remains dry for as long as possible. They know that the battle against damp is never won, only fought, only managed, only endured until the sun goes down and the freezing begins again. They know that a wet blanket is a death sentence, not immediately perhaps, but inevitably, as surely as a fall into a crevasse or an avalanche sweeping down from the slopes above. You think about the previous night, about the moisture that accumulated despite your best efforts. Your breath, condensed on the inside of the blanket, left a layer of frost that melted as soon as you moved, soaking the wool in a thin film of water. Your body, pressed against the ice, generated just enough heat to melt the surface beneath you, creating a damp patch that spread slowly outward as the night wore on. The snow that blew in through gaps in your shelter, the condensation from your cooking, the simple humidity of air that has passed over miles of ice and snow, all of it contributed to the gradual saturation of your blanket. By morning, it was damp. Not wet, not soaked, but noticeably heavier than when you started, noticeably less lofty, noticeably less warm. And now, in the sun, you have a chance to dry it, but only if you are careful, only if you find the right moment and the right place and the right conditions for the slow, patient work of restoring your blanket to something approaching its original state. The guides have techniques for this, passed down through generations of mountain travelers. They know which rocks absorb and radiate heat most effectively, creating natural drying platforms where a blanket can be spread and turned and coaxed back toward dryness. They know how the wind behaves at different times of day, when it will help and when it will hinder, when it will carry moisture away and when it will simply deposit more. They know that direct sunlight is both friend and enemy, drying the surface while leaving the depths damp, creating an illusion of dryness that can kill as surely as wetness itself. They test the blanket constantly, pressing it, feeling it, judging its condition with a sensitivity that comes from years of paying attention to exactly this one thing. You stop for lunch on a rocky outcrop, a rare patch of dry ground in a world of ice and slush, and you spread your blanket on the warmest rocks you can find. The sun beats down, and you watch the steam rise from the wool, a visible sign of the moisture escaping, of your blanket slowly returning to its proper state. It is a slow process, frustratingly slow, and you know that you will not achieve complete dryness before you have to move on, before the afternoon shadows creep across your drying spot and the temperature begins its inevitable decline toward another freezing night. But every bit of moisture removed is a bit of warmth regained, a bit of safety purchased, a bit of life preserved for whatever challenges tomorrow will bring. Historians still debate the exact role of moisture in the great alpine tragedies, the expeditions that set out with high hopes and returned as statistics in the climbing journals. Some argue that wet and cold, working together, killed more climbers than falls or avalanches or any of the more dramatic causes of death. Others point to specific incidents, well-documented cases where a sudden storm or an unexpected bivouac led to saturation and death, where men who survived the immediate danger succumbed to the slow, patient killing power of damp wool and dropping temperatures. What is certain is that every climber who spent significant time in the mountains developed an almost obsessive concern with dryness, a constant awareness of moisture levels, a perpetual anxiety about the condition of the one piece of equipment that could not be allowed to fail. You carry that anxiety now, along with your blanket, and you understand that it is not irrational. It is not excessive. It is simply the price of admission to a world where water, in its frozen and liquid forms, is always watching, always waiting, always ready to claim another victim. The afternoon sun beats down on the glacier, and as you sit on your rocky outcrop watching your blanket slowly steam, you find your mind drifting to the alternatives you might have chosen, the other ways of keeping warm that the 19th century has to offer. You think about fur, first, because fur is the oldest and most obvious solution to the problem of cold. Your ancestors wore fur, your distant ancestors lived in it, and somewhere deep in your genetic memory, there is probably a voice whispering that fur is what you should be wrapped in right now, not this scratchy woven wool from animals too stupid to run away from humans. But fur, for all its primal appeal, has complications that you are grateful not to face. The fur trade, you know, is a brutal business. The trappers who supply the great fur markets of Europe and America spend their winters in conditions that make your alpine adventures look like pleasure outings, setting traps in frozen forests and hauling out the bodies of animals who died in terror and pain. The animals themselves, beaver, marten, sable, fox, are beautiful creatures, and their pelts are undeniably warm. But the process of turning a living animal into a warm coat is not something you want to think about too deeply while you are trying to enjoy the sublime beauty of the mountains. And then there is the question of weight, of bulk, of the sheer impracticality of fur for serious mountain travel. A good fur blanket, the kind that would keep you alive through an alpine night, weighs more than your wool blanket, not less. It requires careful handling to prevent the hide from stiffening and cracking. It attracts moisture in ways that wool does not, the dense fur holding snow and ice against your body until it melts and soaks through to the skin beneath. It is, in short, a solution to a different problem, designed for a different environment, suited to a different kind of cold. You think about down next, because down is the new thing, the exciting thing, the material that everyone is talking about in the climbing clubs and the outfitters' shops. Eider down, specifically, harvested from the nests of eider ducks in the far north, where the birds line their nests with the softest, warmest feathers they can produce. A down blanket, it is said, weighs almost nothing. It compresses into a fraction of the space required by wool. It traps heat with an efficiency that wool cannot match, creating a cloud of warm air around the sleeper that feels like floating on a summer breeze. The wealthy women of Europe already sleep under eiderdown comforters, surrounded by warmth that requires no weight, no bulk, no scratchy fibers against their delicate skin. Why should you not do the same on the mountain? Because down, you remember, has a fatal flaw. One that you have heard about from men who tried it and lived to tell the story, and from men who tried it and did not. Down clumps. When it gets wet, and it will get wet, because you are on a glacier and everything gets wet eventually, the feathers collapse into sodden masses that provide no insulation at all. The air that made them warm is displaced by water, and water conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air. A wet down blanket is worse than useless. It is dangerous, actively dangerous, because it creates the illusion of warmth while delivering nothing but cold. You would be better off with no blanket at all, because at least then you would know that you are cold and take appropriate action. With wet down, you might not realize your danger until it is too late, until the clumping has progressed beyond recovery and your body heat is pouring into the ice beneath you. There is also the question of where down comes from, which is not something the gentlemen climbers like to discuss. The eiderdown trade involves raids on nesting colonies, the taking of feathers that the ducks have plucked from their own breasts to line their nests and keep their eggs warm. The birds, disturbed during this critical period, often abandon their nests, leaving the eggs to chill and the next generation to fail. The harvesters, desperate for the precious down, take what they can without regard for the future, knowing that next year there will be fewer birds and less down, and the cycle will continue until there are no birds left at all. It is not a pretty picture, and it is not one that fits comfortably with the romantic image of alpine adventure that you and your companions are trying to create. You think about linen, briefly, and then you stop thinking about linen because linen is a joke, a material so poorly suited to cold conditions that even mentioning it in the same breath as wool feels absurd. Linen conducts heat away from the body with enthusiastic efficiency. It absorbs moisture like a sponge and holds it against the skin, chilling you from the outside in. It has no loft, no air-trapping capacity, no ability to create a warm microclimate around your body. Linen is for summer, for sheets and shirts and the kind of gentle warmth that requires cooling rather than insulation. On a glacier, linen is a death warrant, and you carry none of it. The guides, you notice, have no interest in these debates. They carry wool, as their fathers carried wool, as their grandfathers carried wool, as generations of mountain people have carried wool since the first sheep wandered into the high valleys and decided that the thin air and steep slopes suited them. They do not wonder whether fur might be warmer or down lighter or linen more comfortable. They know what works, and they know it with a certainty that comes from experience rather than theory. They have seen men die in fur, frozen because their fancy pelts could not shed the moisture that accumulated during a day's climbing. They have seen men die in down, warm until the first snowstorm, then cold until the end. They have seen men die in linen, which does not take long because linen is so efficient at killing. And they have seen men survive in wool, night after night, storm after storm, year after year, because wool does what wool does and nothing else does it quite the same way. Historians still argue about the precise moment when down began to replace wool in the mountains, the transition that would eventually make wool blankets a curiosity rather than a necessity. Some point to the early 20th century, when scientific expeditions to the poles and the highest peaks began experimenting with new materials and new designs. Others argue that the change came later, after the World Wars, when synthetic materials entered the market and changed everything about how humans keep warm. What is certain is that in your time, in this moment on this glacier, wool is still king. It is heavy and scratchy and awkward and damp, but it is also warm and reliable and proven and true. And as you fold your blanket and strap it back to your pack, you are grateful for every one of its limitations, because those limitations are the price of its gifts, and the gifts are keeping you alive. The afternoon wears on, and you climb higher, leaving the relative safety of the glacier for the steep, broken terrain that leads toward the summit ridge. The mountain is changing around you, becoming more serious, more demanding, more obviously a place where mistakes are not forgiven and the margin between success and disaster shrinks with every step. You think about the Matterhorn as you climb, not because you are on the Matterhorn, you are somewhere else entirely, some peak whose name you will forget as soon as you descend, but because the Matterhorn haunts every climber of this era, casting a shadow that reaches across the entire alpine world. And on the Matterhorn, in the summer of 1865, a wool blanket played a role in one of the most famous and tragic stories in the history of mountaineering. You know the story, everyone knows the story, though the details are still debated and the blame still shifts depending on who is telling it and what axe they have to grind. Edward Whymper, the driven, obsessive Englishman who had tried 7 times to climb the mountain, finally succeeded on July 14th, leading a party of 7 to the summit. It was a triumph, the kind of achievement that makes careers and legends and fortunes. But the triumph lasted only as long as the descent. On the way down, one of the men slipped, and the rope connecting the party snapped, and 4 of the 7 plunged to their deaths on the Matterhorn's north face, their bodies never to be recovered, their names forever linked with the mountain's dark mythology. The survivors, Whymper and 2 guides, spent the night on the mountain, huddled together, using what little they had to survive until dawn. And what they had, what they used, what kept them alive through that long, terrible night, was a wool blanket. Not a tent, not a sleeping bag, not any of the specialized equipment that would later become standard for such emergencies. Just a blanket, a single wool blanket, shared among 3 men who had just watched their companions die and knew that they might be next. They wrapped themselves in it, the 3 of them, pressing together for warmth, using the blanket's meager insulation to slow the inevitable loss of heat. They were at over 14,000 feet, with no shelter, no fire, no food, no water, and no certainty that anyone would find them even if they survived until morning. And they did survive, because the blanket was enough, barely enough, but enough. You think about that night as you climb, about what it must have felt like to be those men, to sit in the darkness on the side of the most famous mountain in the world, knowing that your friends were lying somewhere below you on the ice, their bodies broken and cold, and that the same fate could easily be yours before the sun rose again. The blanket, that simple square of wool, must have seemed impossibly thin, impossibly inadequate, a gesture against the cold rather than a defense. And yet it worked, or it worked enough, because 3 men walked down from the Matterhorn the next day who might easily have been 4, or 5, or 6, or 7. The blanket did not save them, not exactly. It just gave them a chance, a slightly better chance than they would have had without it, and they took that chance and turned it into survival. The debate about what happened on the Matterhorn, about who was to blame for the accident and whether it could have been prevented, has raged ever since that night. Some say the rope was old, inadequate, never meant to hold such a load. Others blame the inexperienced member of the party, the one who slipped and started the chain reaction. Still others point to Whimper himself, suggesting that his ambition, his drive, his refusal to turn back even when prudence suggested otherwise, created the conditions for disaster. What is not debated, what no one disputes, is that the survivors spent the night on the mountain, and that they spent it wrapped in a wool blanket, and that the blanket did what blankets do. It kept them warm enough to live. You imagine them there, the three men, sitting on the rocks with the blanket draped over their shoulders, listening to the wind and the silence and the occasional sound of falling rock from the face where their companions died. They must have talked, must have tried to make sense of what had happened, must have planned for the morning and the descent and the long walk back to civilization with news that would shatter families and end careers and change the way the world thought about mountains. Or perhaps they sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, his fears, his memories of the men who were no longer there. The blanket, shared among them, would have been a connection as much as a covering, a physical reminder that they were still alive, still together, still capable of helping each other through whatever came next. You think about your own blanket, strapped to your pack, and you wonder what it will see before this journey is over. Will it be just another piece of equipment, carried up and down without incident, a footnote in the story of a successful climb? Or will it become something more, something essential, something that future generations will write about and argue over and use as evidence in their endless debates about what happened and why? You hope for the former, of course. You hope for boredom, for routine, for the kind of climb that produces no stories worth telling because nothing went wrong enough to be memorable. But the mountain does not care what you hope for. The mountain will give you what it gives you, and your blanket will be there, ready or not, adequate or not, enough or not. Historians still argue about the exact role of equipment in the Matterhorn disaster, about whether better ropes or better anchors or better decision-making could have changed the outcome. Some say the accident was inevitable, the result of pushing too hard in too difficult terrain with too little experience. Others insist that it was a freak occurrence, a 1-in-1,000 slip that could have happened to anyone and did happen to four men who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. What is certain is that the blanket, the humble wool blanket that kept three men alive through the night, became a symbol of something important. The idea that survival in the mountains depends not on the latest technology or the most advanced equipment, but on the fundamental human ability to endure, to adapt, to make do with whatever is at hand. Your blanket, heavy and scratchy and inadequate as it sometimes seems, is part of that tradition. And as you climb higher, toward your own summit and your own uncertain future, you carry that tradition with you, woven into every fiber. The afternoon deepens into evening, and you find yourself once again searching for a place to spend the night, this time higher on the mountain, in a world that feels even more remote and hostile than the glacier below. You are tired, deeply tired, in ways that go beyond simple physical exhaustion and touch something closer to the bone. Your body aches, your mind feels thick and slow, and every movement requires a conscious effort that seems to drain resources you do not have. But you cannot stop, not yet, because stopping in the wrong place is as dangerous as continuing when you should rest. You need to find your spot, your corner of this vast and indifferent world, and you need to make it yours before the light fades completely and the cold returns with its nightly appetite. You find it eventually, a narrow ledge just wide enough for a man to lie down, sheltered by an overhang of rock that will break the worst of the wind. It is not comfortable. It is not even particularly safe, given the drop just beyond its edge and the loose rocks that litter its surface. But it is something, a place, a location in the immense geography of the mountain where you can stop and rest and pretend, for a few hours, that you belong here. You drop your pack and you begin the ritual again, the familiar movements of preparing your bed, spreading your blanket, arranging your few possessions in the space that will contain your entire world until morning. The blanket, as you unfold it, becomes more than just a covering. It becomes a territory, a piece of civilization carried into the wilderness, A declaration that here, on this narrow ledge at the edge of the world, a human being intends to survive the night. You spread it on the rock, and suddenly the rock is not just rock anymore. It is a bed, a foundation, a surface that has been claimed and transformed by the presence of wall. You lie down on it, and the scratchy fibers against your cheek become a kind of comfort, a familiar sensation in a world where nothing else is familiar. You pull a corner over your shoulder, and the weight of it, the pressure of it, becomes a reassurance that you are not alone, that you are wrapped in something that cares about you, even if that something is only woven sheep hair and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The concept of territory, of claiming a space as your own, is central to the experience of sleeping on a mountain. The mountain itself is indifferent, hostile, actively trying to kill you through cold and wind and the simple physics of exposure. But the blanket creates a boundary, a zone of relative safety, a place where the mountain's rules are temporarily suspended. Inside the blanket, you are warm. Inside the blanket, you are dry enough. Inside the blanket, you are alive, and that aliveness, that stubborn persistence of being, is a kind of victory against everything the mountain represents. The blanket does not defeat the cold, not really. It just holds it at bay, creates a pocket of warmth in the vast coldness, a tiny bubble of civilization in a world that has never heard of civilization and would not care if it had. You think about the other climbers who have done this before you, the ones who spent nights on ledges not unlike this one, wrapped in blankets not unlike yours, waiting for dawn and hoping for survival. Some of them made it, obviously, because you have read their accounts, studied their routes, followed in their footsteps. Others did not, and their bones lie somewhere below, in crevasses or on slopes where no one will ever find them, their blankets long since rotted or buried or carried away by the wind. What separated the survivors from the victims? Luck, certainly, because luck always plays a role in the mountains. But also something else, something harder to define, a stubborn refusal to give up, a determination to claim whatever small territory they could and hold it against the night. The blanket helps with this. It gives you something to hold on to, literally and figuratively. When the wind screams and the cold bites and every instinct tells you to get up, to move, to do something, the blanket anchors you. It reminds you that you have already done what you can do, that the only remaining task is to endure, that endurance is itself an achievement. You wrap yourself in it and you wait, and in the waiting you discover something about yourself that you might never have learned otherwise. You discover that you can endure more than you thought, that the human body and the human spirit are capable of persisting through conditions that should, by all rights, extinguish them. The blanket is just wool, just fabric, just a thing. But it is also a partner in this endurance, a collaborator in the project of staying alive. The guides understand this in a way that you are only beginning to grasp. They have spent so many nights on so many ledges, wrapped in so many blankets, that the experience has become almost routine. They do not romanticize it, do not turn it into metaphor or meaning. They simply do it, night after night, year after year, because this is what their lives require. But watch them closely, at the moment when they settle into their blankets, and you will see something. A relaxation, a softening, a small release of tension that signals the beginning of rest. They are claiming their territory too, marking their small space in the mountain's immensity, and the blanket is the tool that makes this claiming possible. Without it, they would be just men on a ledge, exposed and vulnerable and unable to truly rest. With it, they are something else. Men in a bed, however temporary, however inadequate, however close to the edge. You lie there now, on your own ledge, wrapped in your own blanket, and you feel it too. The sense of territory, of possession, of having made a place for yourself in a place that does not want you. The blanket is your flag, your border, your declaration of presence. It says that you were here, that you claimed this spot, that for one night at least, You held the mountain at bay and survived. Tomorrow you will fold it up and move on, and the ledge will revert to its natural state, bare rock and empty air and the memory of your passing. But tonight it is yours. Tonight it is home. Historians still debate the psychological aspects of early mountaineering, the ways in which climbers coped with the immense stress of spending nights in such exposed and dangerous places. Some emphasize the role of faith, of trust in God or providence or the simple goodness of the universe. Others point to the practical mindset of the guides, their ability to focus on immediate tasks rather than existential dread. What is certain is that the blanket, the humble wool blanket, played a role in this coping as surely as it played a role in physical survival. It provided a boundary, a definition, a small piece of the familiar in a world defined by the unfamiliar. And on a night like this, with the stars coming out and the temperature dropping and the vast silence of the mountain pressing in from all sides, that small piece of the familiar is worth more than all the philosophy in the world. The morning comes slowly, reluctantly, the sun taking its time to climb over the distant peaks and reach your ledge with its reluctant warmth. You have survived another night, and as you lie there in your blanket, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the first pale hints of gold, you think about the future. Not your future, specifically, though that is certainly on your mind as you contemplate another day of climbing and another night of uncertain shelter. No, you think about the future of the blanket itself, about what will happen to this humble piece of equipment in the decades to come, as technology advances and materials improve and the old ways are gradually replaced by the new. You are witnessing, without quite realizing it, the beginning of the end for the heavy wool blanket as a piece of mountain equipment. The signs are already there, if you know where to look. In the outfitters' shops of London and Paris, new materials are appearing alongside the traditional wool. Rubberized canvas, as you have seen, is becoming more reliable, more practical, more widely available. Lightweight tents, designed specifically for mountain use, are being tested and improved. Sleeping bags, those curious inventions that combine insulation and enclosure in a single garment, are beginning to appear in the catalogs, though they are still expensive and rare and viewed with suspicion by the traditionalists. The blanket, for all its proven reliability, is facing competition from objects that promise to do its job better, lighter, more efficiently. And in the long run, as you suspect even now, that competition will prove fatal. The sleeping bag is the most serious challenger. The idea is simple enough. Instead of wrapping yourself in a blanket, which can shift and gap and let in drafts, why not create a bag that encloses you completely, trapping warm air in a sealed chamber and preventing the cold from reaching your skin? Early versions are made of wool, naturally, because wool is what works, but designers are already experimenting with down fill, with multiple layers, with waterproof shells that promise to keep the sleeper dry even in the worst conditions. A good sleeping bag, it is said, can be 10 degrees warmer than a blanket of the same weight, maybe more. And it cannot fall off in the night, cannot be kicked aside by restless sleepers, cannot leave your shoulders exposed when you turn over. It is, in every measurable way, an improvement. But improvements come with costs, and the sleeping bag's costs are significant. It is less versatile than a blanket, for one thing. You cannot use a sleeping bag as a tent, cannot spread it on the ground to sit on, cannot wave it as a signal or wrap it around an injured companion or fold it into a pillow. It is designed for one purpose and one purpose only, and if that purpose is not what you need at any given moment, you are out of luck. It is also harder to dry, its multiple layers and enclosed design trapping moisture in ways that can be difficult to manage. And it is more expensive, significantly more expensive, putting it out of reach of the guides and porters who have always relied on wool and will continue to rely on it long after the gentleman climbers have moved on to the latest innovations. The blanket's defenders, and there are many, point to these limitations as evidence that wool will never be fully replaced. They argue that versatility matters, that a piece of equipment which can do many things adequately is more valuable than one which does one thing perfectly. They note that the blanket has been proven over centuries, while sleeping bags have been proven over years at most. They remind anyone who will listen that new technologies often fail in unexpected ways, that the mountain is unforgiving of untested ideas, that the men who die from innovation are just as dead as the men who die from conservatism. And for a while, for several decades, these arguments carry the day. The blanket persists. It remains standard equipment for guides, for serious climbers, for anyone who cannot afford or does not trust the newfangled alternatives. But the pressure does not stop. New materials continue to appear, each one promising to solve some problem that wool cannot address. Synthetic fabrics, derived from coal and petroleum, begin to emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, offering properties that natural fibers cannot match. They are lighter, stronger, more water-resistant, more predictable. They do not rot or mildew. They can be engineered to specific specifications, tuned to particular applications in ways that wool, with its natural variability, cannot match. And they are cheap, or at least cheaper than high-quality wool, putting warmth within reach of people who could never afford the finest blankets from the best mills. The guides, practical as always, adapt. They do not abandon wool entirely, not for a long time, because wool still does things that synthetics cannot. But they incorporate the new materials into their kits, using rubberized ground cloths to keep their blankets dry, carrying lightweight tarps for emergency shelter, experimenting with down vests and synthetic layers for the coldest conditions. They become hybrid creatures, like you are now, carrying both old and new, using each for what it does best. And in the process, they begin the long transition away from the blanket as the centerpiece of mountain survival. Historians still argue about exactly when the heavy wool blanket ceased to be essential mountain equipment. Some point to the 1920s and 1930s, when lightweight sleeping bags became truly practical and began to appear on major expeditions. Others argue for the post-war period, when synthetic materials exploded onto the market and changed everything about how humans keep warm in cold places. What is certain is that by the middle of the 20th century, the blanket had been relegated to a supporting role, a backup, a piece of nostalgia carried by traditionalists and romantics. The future belonged to sleeping bags, to synthetic fills, to high-tech materials that would have seemed like magic to the men who first wrapped themselves in wool on the glacier of the Alps. And you, lying there on your ledge with the morning sun finally reaching your face, are part of that transition, whether you know it or not. You fold your blanket for what feels like the 1000th time, its familiar weight and texture a comfort in the morning cold, and you think about the legacy it will leave behind. Not the blanket itself, which will eventually wear out or be lost or simply be replaced by something newer and better, but the idea of the blanket, the principles it embodies, the lessons it has taught to generations of mountain travelers. Even as new materials and new designs push the old wool aside, they carry forward something of its spirit, something of its approach to the problem of keeping humans alive in places where humans were never meant to survive. The blanket dies, in a sense, but it also lives on, transformed and adapted and reincarnated in every sleeping bag that will ever keep a climber warm through an alpine night. Consider the sleeping bag, that direct descendant of the blanket. Early sleeping bags were literally just blankets folded and sewn into a tube, a simple modification that addressed the blanket's most obvious weakness, its tendency to gap and shift in the night. The same wool, the same weave, the same insulating properties, just arranged differently. Later bags added hoods, draft tubes, zippers, all the features that would become standard, but the core remained the same, a layer of insulation between the sleeper and the cold, trapping air, managing moisture, creating a microclimate of warmth in a world of ice. The blanket's DNA runs through every one of them, visible to anyone who knows what to look for. The materials changed, obviously. Down replaced wool in many applications, offering lighter weight and greater compressibility at the cost of vulnerability to moisture. Then synthetics replaced down in some applications, offering consistent performance even when wet at the cost of bulk and weight. Then hybrids appeared, combining materials to get the best of multiple worlds. But through all these changes, the fundamental design remained the blanket's design, a layer of insulation, trapped air, managed moisture, the body's own heat reflected back against the cold. The blanket taught the sleeping bag what it needed to know, and the sleeping bag, for all its high-tech sophistication, has never forgotten its teacher. Consider also the bivouac sack, that minimalist shelter that became popular in the late 20th century among climbers who wanted to travel fast and light. A bivy sack is essentially a waterproof shell that fits over a sleeping bag, protecting it from moisture and wind while adding minimal weight and bulk. But the concept, the idea of wrapping yourself in a protective layer that is not quite a tent and not quite a bag, owes something to the blanket as well. Those climbers who used their blankets as emergency shelters, draping them over ice axes and weighting the edges with rocks, were practicing a form of bivouacking long before anyone coined the term. They understood that a piece of fabric, properly arranged, could become a shelter, a windbreak, a refuge. The bivy sack simply makes that understanding permanent, turns it into a piece of equipment rather than an improvised response. The guides, those practical men who taught you so much, would probably laugh at this talk of legacy and influence. They would point out that a blanket is a blanket, a tool for a job, and that thinking too much about its place in history is a luxury for people who do not have to carry one up a mountain every day. But they would also, if pressed, acknowledge that the blanket has taught them things they could not have learned otherwise. It has taught them about moisture, about the way water moves through fabric and what happens when it freezes. It has taught them about wind, about how moving air steals heat and how to position themselves to minimize its effects. It has taught them about their own bodies, about how much heat they produce and how quickly they lose it and what it feels like when the balance tips toward danger. These lessons, learned through nights on the ice wrapped in wool, become part of who they are, part of how they approach every subsequent challenge. The blanket, in teaching them, changes them. And they, in turn, pass those changes on to everyone they guide, everyone they teach, everyone who follows in their footsteps. You think about your own education as you finish packing, about everything this mountain has taught you and everything your blanket has made possible. You have learned to read the wind, to find shelter in unlikely places, to manage your own body's heat and moisture with a precision you never imagined possible. You have learned that comfort is relative, that a flat rock can be a bed and a wool blanket can be a home, and that the human capacity for endurance is far greater than you ever suspected. You have learned, most of all, that survival is not a matter of equipment alone, not a matter of having the right stuff in your pack. It is a matter of attitude, of will, of the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. The blanket helped you learn this, but it did not teach you. You taught yourself, with the blanket as your partner and your witness and your occasionally inadequate shield against the cold. The legacy of the blanket, then, is not just in the sleeping bags and bivy sacks that followed it. It is in the climbers themselves, in the thousands of men and women who spent nights wrapped in wool and came down from the mountains changed by the experience. It is in the knowledge they carried with them, the lessons they passed on, the traditions they established and maintained. It is in the very idea of alpinism, which would be unthinkable without the nights spent on ledges and glacier, the long dark hours when the only thing between a climber and death was a piece of woven sheep hair and the determination to use it correctly. The blanket made alpinism possible, and alpinism, in turn, made the blanket legendary. Historians still debate the exact nature of this legacy, the ways in which a simple piece of equipment shaped an entire sport and an entire approach to wilderness travel. Some emphasize the practical, the direct line of descent from blanket to sleeping bag to modern high-tech insulation. Others focus on the cultural, the way the blanket became a symbol of a certain kind of toughness, a certain acceptance of discomfort and risk. What is certain is that every climber who has ever spent a night in the mountains, from the earliest pioneers to the most modern alpinists, owes something to that heavy wool blanket. It may be forgotten, may be replaced, may be reduced to a footnote in the history of equipment. But its influence persists, woven into the fabric of mountaineering as surely as wool was once woven into the fabric that kept you alive through the long cold night. The summit is behind you now, and you are descending, moving down through the familiar terrain of rock and ice toward the valley that holds warmth and food and the comforting presence of other humans. The climb is over, or nearly over, and you have time to think about what you have learned, what you will carry away from this experience beyond the memories and the photographs and the stories you will tell when you get home. The blanket is still there, strapped to your pack, lighter now than it was at the start because some of its moisture has finally evaporated in the sun, but still heavy, still present, still demanding to be carried and cared for and acknowledged. You will carry it all the way down, all the way to the valley, all the way to the inn where you will spread it on a bed and sleep for 12 hours straight and wake to find that someone has folded it and put it away without being asked. And then you will carry it home, back to England or France or wherever you came from, and it will go into a closet or a trunk, and you will not think about it again until the next time you plan a climb. But something will have changed. Something in you will have shifted, subtly but permanently, because of what you have experienced and what the blanket has helped you survive. You will look at blankets differently now, will notice their weight and texture in ways you never did before. You will understand, in a way that cannot be unlearned, what it means to depend on a piece of fabric for your very life. You will know that warmth is not just comfort but survival, that dryness is not just preference but necessity, that the line between a good night and a fatal one is thinner than you ever imagined. These understandings will stay with you, will color every future experience of cold and wind and darkness, will make you a different person than the one who walked up this mountain just a few days ago. The guides, as they descend beside you, carry their own understandings, their own accumulated wisdom from countless nights on countless mountains. They do not need to think about what they have learned, it is part of them, woven into their movements and their judgments and their quiet, unshakable confidence. They know that the mountain will always be there, that the cold will always return, that the night will always demand its price from those who dare to spend it on the ice. They know that a blanket is just a tool, but that a tool, properly used, can make the difference between a story told and a body never found. And they know, most of all, that the real lesson of the blanket is not about wool or warmth or any physical property. It is about respect. Respect for the cold, respect for the mountain, respect for the limits of human endurance and the small margin by which we sometimes exceed them. You think about this as you walk, about the things you will take away from this climb that have nothing to do with summits or routes or any of the measurable achievements that climbers use to measure themselves against each other. You will take away the memory of the wind, how it sounded and felt and how it tried to steal your warmth in the night. You will take away the memory of the stars, how close they seemed and how indifferent, burning in their cold fires while you huddled in your blanket below. You will take away the memory of the morning, the first light on the ice, the realization that you had survived, the quiet gratitude that filled you as you unfolded yourself and began another day. These memories are the real summit, the real achievement, the thing you came for without knowing it. The blanket, when you finally unpack it in the valley, will smell of smoke and sweat and the indefinable scent of high places. You will shake it out, fold it, put it away, and for a while you will forget about it. But years from now, decades from now, when you are old and your climbing days are behind you, you will take it out again. You will hold it, feel its weight, smell its smell, and you will remember. You will remember the night on the glacier, the wind and the cold and the fear. You will remember the guides, their quiet competence, their patient teaching. You will remember yourself, younger and stronger and more alive than you ever felt before or since. And you will understand, in that moment, that the blanket was never just a blanket. It was a vessel, a container for experience, a physical object that held the memory of everything you lived through in the high places where humans were never meant to go. And so you descend, down through the softening light of afternoon, down toward the valley and the inn and the warm bed that awaits you there. The blanket is heavy on your back, but you do not mind the weight. You have earned the right to carry it, have paid for it in nights of cold and days of effort, have made it yours in ways that no purchase could ever achieve. It will go with you into the future, this square of woven wool, this humble piece of equipment, this partner in survival. And when you finally lay it down, when you take it out in some distant year and hold it and remember, you will know that it gave you something beyond warmth, beyond comfort, beyond the simple fact of staying alive. It gave you a story. It gave you a memory. It gave you a night on the mountain that will stay with you until the end of your days, wrapped in wool, watching the stars, knowing that you were exactly where you belonged. As you finally drift off, there in the valley inn with a real roof over your head and a real bed beneath you, the memory of that night on the ice begins to soften, to fade, to transform itself into something you can carry without being crushed by it. The wind becomes a whisper, the cold becomes a shiver remembered rather than felt. The fear becomes a story you tell yourself about how brave you were. And the blanket, that heavy wool blanket, becomes what it always was. Just a blanket, a thing of fiber and weave, a tool for a job. But you know now, in the quiet space between waking and sleeping, that it was also more. It was a teacher. It was a companion. It was a small square of civilization in a world that has never heard of civilization and would not care if it had. And as you close your eyes, as the warmth of the inn wraps around you like the softest down, you carry that knowledge with you into sleep, into dreams, into whatever comes next. The mountain will be there tomorrow, and the next day, and for all the days after that. But tonight you are here, in the valley, in the warmth, in the safety that you earned the hard way, one night at a time, wrapped in wool, watching the stars, remembering what it meant to be alive.